Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new SENTRIES record, Snow as a Metaphor for Death. There are plenty of artists within recent memory who have made amazing bodies of work via the introduction of a number of different older influences that they then provide a fresh spin, their own unique take on, especially within the realm of industrial rock, noise rock, no wave, and other genres of music that people with 3 friends maximum listen to. I'm allowed to make that joke because I am among them. Perhaps the most notable example of this sort of phenomenon would have been last year, 2023's Model Actress, with their debut album, Dog's Body, their first full-length studio album, which combined everything from dance punk to KMFDM-esque electro-industrial to create something that on paper seemed extremely derivative, but in execution ended up being one of the most oddly refreshing and outright intense records you could get across any genre of music throughout the entirety of the year. And if you want to go outside of those aforementioned genres into stuff that is at least slightly less esoteric in nature, you can talk about bands like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, or for a more alternative/indie band, Snooper. These bands that are taking sounds from a variety of genres whose biggest names often came and went 20, 30, 40 years ago, and taking those sounds from them and reinventing them into something that is entirely new. Bands that sound unoriginal on paper, but somehow in execution manage to be infinitely more unique, creative, and filled with personality than you would likely expect by the average person's description of them. And now that brings me to SENTRIES, a band that I do think you could kind of put in that exact category, actually. Last year's Agonizer was the first full-length studio album from Canadian noise rock, industrial project, whatever you want to consider them, project SENTRIES. And you know what? Solid record, I enjoyed it, but I didn't talk about it on the channel because I felt like at times it came across as a bit underdeveloped, but the ideas were drowning in potential, and I was really excited for whatever the follow-up would be. And considering I am covering the follow-up on the channel, I think that you can tell that I was right in hoping it would be good. Look, all I can really say is that Snow as a Metaphor for Death, the sophomore studio album from SENTRIES' is Kim Elliot, the sole member of this project, is a wickedly huge step up for this project and everything that comes along with it. Look, I'm just going to get this part out of the way first. There are bound to be countless comparisons made between this record and any given industrial band from a handful of decades ago, and I mean, you know what, that's kind of fair in a way. That can especially be said about some of the more industrial techno-fusion tracks like Entity/Selector. I mean, I don't really think you need a vast knowledge of the genre's history or of music history to be able to say that Killing Joke definitely paved the way for the kind of sounds on those tracks multiple decades ago. But at the same time, I think that there are also some more punkish moments, tracks like Witches, for example, that are more rooted in the no-wave scene, seemingly at least, albeit in a much more full, lush, less minimalistic and disturbed musically kind of way than a band like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks would have most likely pulled off back in the 80s, but I digress. My point still stands. There are plenty of very obvious influences here. With all of that being said, none of the material on Snow as a Metaphor for Death ever really feels derivative of its influences. It more just feels like a major expansion upon those influences being done in Kim Elliot's own unique way. And, I mean, that's sort of a conversation that has to come up with any record, if I'm being totally honest. Is something derivative, or is it just influenced by something? And in this case, I certainly think that it's the latter rather than the former, and the fact that the majority of the discourse that has surrounded this album that I've seen has been regarding its influences rather than the content there within, that's kind of disappointing in my opinion, because there's a lot to dig into here. Though I guess I am kind of feeding the fire by bringing up the topic at all in my review. Huh. Look, my point still stands. As an artist, Kim Elliot is able to give things his own unique flair, and that is what is essential for this record, some of the minor details that he slips in there that makes this album entirely his and his alone. I mean, for example, the aforementioned Entity/Selector, yes, heavy electro-industrial noise rock influence going on there, very distorted yet danceable kind of sound, but at the same time, it ends off with this sort of progressively increasing tempo that allows it to explode into the following song, the significantly more raw and violent sounding Ding Ding Ding, and it's those small passages like that that really give this album an entirely unique identity. This is an album that had a lot of love put into it, and you can see that in the smaller details such as those. Elsewhere, you have the track Performance Art, which opens the album up very nicely with a lot of noise influences that give things almost an industrial gothic kind of feel, which is personally a sonic aesthetic that I always heavily enjoy. That being said, it doesn't feel campy or anything like that, and it doesn't even take over the majority of the album. It just sort of sets an intense mood at the very beginning of the record, and that isn't even to mention how the album ends with the 13-minute long title track Far and Away, the longest song on the record, being this really epic finale that feels shockingly fitting for this kind of album. I mean, generally speaking, unless you're called Sprain, there haven't been too terribly many bands this wild in recent memory that have been able to pull off these grand, sweeping songs particularly well, but I mean, hey, here we are. It's an amazing way to end out the record. In fact, it's so powerful and striking at times that I would almost say it's adjacent to some post-rock outfits, not necessarily in terms of actual sound, but in terms of raw emotion. Sort of post-rock from the torture chamber, if you will. Kim Elliot is quite a phenomenal vocalist as well. I mean, he certainly fits the role on this record, and just in general, I think the guy has a huge amount of personality. I mean, there's just such raw passion on tracks like How Many Fools Can I Kill Today that just acts as this sort of opponent to swirling walls of guitar and explosive drums, to the point that his vocals on here may as well act as a secondary guitar in terms of instrumentation, because that is truly how powerful he is behind the mic. I mean, as an actual vocal personality, I would even go as far as to say that Elliot is a bit of a volatile figure, not in a bad way or anything like that, but as he seamlessly bounces between this careless, slacker, indie rocker kind of tone and the more intense, unfiltered screaming that you expect from the more noise-emphasized side of noise rock, it's really impressive just how dynamic he can be as a performer. Especially on some of the more up-tempo, punky kind of tracks here, I find myself tired on his behalf. I mean, the guy's vocal cords sound like they're about to explode at times, and because of that, I gotta say, I am really blown away by some of the better vocal moments here. The track Seance also sees Elliot kind of take a change of pace, you know, kind of become more of an imposing and I would say generally somewhat theatrical performer, going in a more dramatic direction in terms of vocal style, and as a whole I think that's just a nice sprinkle of variety. I think that after, at that point on the record, at least 6 extremely intense vocal performances, it's nice to sort of break things up with a vocal performance that's emotional but in an entirely different way. So yeah, as a whole, vocal work on here, pretty fantastic. I would say that Snow as a Metaphor for Death as a record really was sort of Kim Elliot's platform to show off his dynamic and striking qualities as a personality behind the mic, and I would personally say that he utilized that platform to the absolute best of his ability here. Snow as a Metaphor for Death is often also a pretty heavily atmospheric record, too. Not necessarily in the way of it being ambient in any way. This is the antithesis of most ambient music. Dead Can Dance, this is absolutely not. But that being said, there is a lot of atmosphere to dig into here if you're really lending your ears to this record and actively paying attention to it. The DIY nature of Sentries as a project gives a pretty naturally raw sound. I think that goes without saying. That's just kind of how DIY as an entire world within the music realm across any genre works. Just natural rawness at your hand there because of the fact that it is being made by you and you alone. And that's great. Of course, that's there, that's present, it's fantastic, but really it's the openness of the audio quality here that I feel really gives the record the sort of live in the studio sound that suits noise and noise-based music beautifully. Seeing as this is an entirely solo project at this point, at least, Kim Elliot produced this album on his own, and once again, that shows the guy as an incredibly impressive, singular artistic force, and the production here is genuinely fantastic at times, with the vast majority of the record feeling like it's quite literally unveiling itself before your eyes, and I think that that's a great quality to have. It comes across as a live album despite it, well, not being a live album. I do think there are a couple of odd creative decisions here, just stuff that doesn't really click with me personally. For example, the drums on the otherwise great track Force are significantly more lo-fi in nature than they are on the vast majority of the record, and that works great for the song on its own. That drum tone is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but in the context of the album, when everything surrounding it is a bit different in terms of audio quality, it ends up coming across as a little bit awkward. That's just really a small thing, though, in the grand scheme of things. And as a whole, I would say that Elliot's creative direction is rightfully very confident throughout this. I would say that in terms of extremely raw DIY albums like this, being personal is one of the best things it can be, and that goes both ways. This is obviously a very personal album for Kim Elliot as an artist, for SENTRIES as a project, and that can be found in the extremely emotional and striking way that a lot of the performances on this record go. That is something that I've described already, but I just want to say it again. This is an extremely powerful album, an extremely aggressive album from a musical standpoint. However, it also ends up being personal for the listener as well, as the instrumentals here, which are otherwise cold and unforgiving in nature, feel full of life, and if this had flat production, it just would not work. There are a number of potentially strong noise rock bands out there that I just don't think end up succeeding because of mediocre production work. Production that's too clean, or even in some cases, production that's too distorted. But I feel like the perfect middle ground was found here, and it ultimately results in an album that is incredibly easy to access for those who are willing to be open-minded towards more noise-based music, but at the same time, I think also is an incredibly destructive, massive, monolithic, insert word for very large and powerful here, album. I mean, really, the personal quality from Kim comes from a place of entirely ambition above all else, and the passion that comes with that natural ambition, whereas the personal quality for the listener mainly comes from a place of great instrumentation, intensity, really Elliot's rawness as a whole, but more than all of that, like I said, production prowess, and that is something on display here massively. Kim Elliot and the SENTRIES project has grown so much in such a brief amount of time, honestly, and I know that it's way too early. It is undeniably way too early to be making any sort of comments about longevity or anything like that, but with that in mind, I will say this. There is potential that, say, 5 years from now, SENTRIES could be one of the bigger names within noise rock, within industrial rock. I don't necessarily think that it's too crazy, too out there, too shocking of a statement to make that one. I think it's genuinely a very possible thing if you give it some time, so long as the quality that's found here is consistent throughout whatever comes next for Kim Elliot. And you know what? Canada is actually a country with a pretty rich history for this kind of stuff in general. I actually feel like people sort of forget that at times, but I mean, think about it. Strapping Young Lad, Frontline Assembly, and even Skinny Puppy, they all came from Vancouver alone, not to mention the rest of the entire country of Canada. That's one city. So there's a pretty huge legacy to live up to there in terms of making high-quality music within this particular realm of experimentation. And honestly, I think that SENTRIES and Kim Elliot as an artist are well on their way to getting their names added to a list with the rest of the greats of industrial and noise-based music. I genuinely think that this album is pretty phenomenal, and I feel like it might only be uphill from here. Nardwuar may still be the single most ardent Canadian active in the music industry at the moment, but I'll be damned if Kim Elliot doesn't give him at least a run for his money here. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.